Now, in proper pedagogical fashion, I want to begin my presentation this morning with a parable. Of course, Jesus always began his public teaching with a parable, and what better role model for a Catholic educator is there than that? So here's the parable. Concerns a guy roughly my stage in life, that is his mid-40s, who is going through that absolutely inevitable midlife crisis. And the particular way he decides to tackle it is he's going to physically rejuvenate himself. So he seeks out the best plastic surgeon in town, and he has the works, facelift, tummy tuck, the whole deal. He takes out a membership at a gym, and he's pumping iron, so he becomes buff and trim. And finally, he is feeling triumphant about the results, and he wants to strut his stuff. So he goes to the local Barnes & Noble, picks out a couple of Gen X-oriented magazines, then goes up to the counter. And as he's paying for them, he asks the clerk, "By the way, would you mind telling me how old you think I am?" And the clerk looks him up and down and says, "I don't know, I would say late 20s, early 30s, something like that." Guy says, "I'm actually 47. Clerk, "Oh, that's amazing. My God, what's your secret? How do you look so great?" So now the guy is feeling great and he wants to do it again. So he leaves the Barnes & Noble and he goes next door to the McDonald's. Now, it's lunch rush at the McDonald's, so he has to wait his turn in line, but finally he gets to the counter, orders his his Happy Meal, and as he's paying for it, he says to the teenager who's taking his money, "By the way, would you mind telling me how old you think I am?" And again, the teen looks him up and down and says, "Well, I don't know, I'm going to say 31, 32, for sure no more than 35. Guy says, "I'm actually 47 years old." Again, the teen is amazing. That's incredible. I mean, I have to know how you do that because I hope I look that good when I'm your age. Okay, so now the guy is on cloud nine. He wants one last jolt of affirmation. So, leaves the McDonald's, walks around the block a couple of times. Finally, he comes to a cluster of people around a bus stop at the end of the block. He walks up to one elderly woman and he says, "Excuse me, ma'am, don't mean to disturb you, but would you mind humoring me and tell me how old you think I am?" And the woman says, "Well, I tell you what, if you take off all of your clothes, run around in a circle, and bark like a dog, I'll tell you how old you are." The guy thinks, well, this is a little weird, but, he's determined to know if he can beat the system, and so he does it. He strips naked, he runs around, he's howling at the moon. People are obviously going nuts. They're whipping out their BlackBerries to text the cops and so on. And finally, as things are on the brink of complete chaos, he stops and he looks the woman in the eye and he says, "All right, how old am I?" And she says, "Well, I tell you, you're 47 years old." Now, the guy is obviously flabbergasted, and he says, "No, that's impossible. I have to know. How do you do it? How does it work?" She said, "I'll tell you how it works. I was behind you in line at the McDonald's." The point of the parable, ladies and gentlemen, is this. Beware of anyone who stands before you claiming to possess esoteric means of revealing the essentially unknowable. Because if you take them too seriously, you are going to end up naked, running around in a circle, and barking like a dog. Now, the truth is, I don't read tea leaves, I don't cast horoscopes. Honestly, I have no better claim to know the Catholic future than anyone else in this room. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to suggest to you that the effort to look down the line at what might be coming is justified. Not so much because of what it tells us about the future, but rather what it tells us about the present. That is, it invites us to kind of look beyond isolated events and random news headlines and try to get our hands around those forces that truly are most fundamental, most pregnant with consequence, if you like, in terms of shaping the Catholic future. And that's what we're going to do together here today through the guise of the material from my recent book, The Future Church. This is my effort to identify 10 forces that I believe are currently at work, sort of cutting through the global church and carrying it towards tomorrow. Now, in the interest of time here today, we're probably only going to be able to touch upon 3 or 4 of these trends. The obvious corollary there, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you want the skinny on the rest of them, you really have no choice. You're just going to have to buy the book. And just as a footnote, I know the holidays have already passed us by, but, ordinations and graduations are right around the corner, I promise you. It's a perfect stocking stuffer for that special Catholic in your life. Now, so bit of table setting number 1 is, look at these trends not so much as predictions, as prophecy, as augury. Look at them as an attempt to identify fundamental forces that are very much alive in the today of the church, the present of the church. All right, bit of table setting number 2 is this. What we are engaged in today is a descriptive rather than a prescriptive exercise. That is, we are living today in the land of is rather than the land of ought. That is to say, I'm not suggesting to you that these are the 10 forces that ought to be shaping the future of the Catholic Church. Probably we all have some ideas about that, and it would be a very interesting conversation to share our perspectives. But that's a conversation for another time. Instead, what I'm trying to suggest is that on the very best effort I can provide, based upon literally hundreds of thousands of miles of travel on the highways and byways of the Catholic world, speaking to cardinals and archbishops and bishops and theologians and rank and file laity and on, this is my attempt to identify forces that really are shaping the Catholic future, whatever you and I might privately think about them. Okay? Clear enough? With that, let's get into the meat of it. First trend we're going to talk about is what I call the emergence of a world church. The picture you see on this slide comes from Benedict XVI's March 2009 trip to Africa. The Holy Father visited the Cameroon and Angola on that occasion. This was the last event on his itinerary in Cameroon. He was greeted by a delegation of local indigenous persons, popularly known as pygmies, who, as you can see, did a little dance for the Pope, and then at the end they presented him with a memento of his visit, which, believe it or not, was a giant sea turtle. Now, as the enterprising Vatican reporter that I am, I immediately scuttled off to the Vatican spokesperson, Jesuit Father Federico Lombardi, to ask him what was going to become of this turtle. And I was told that it was being airlifted back to Rome. Now, Father Lombardi declined comment on the obvious follow-up question, which is, okay, once it gets to Rome, what's going to happen? Is it going to become a pet, an ingredient in a soup? What are we talking about here? So I still don't know what happened to the turtle. What I do know is that this picture captures in a flash some of the profound demographic transformations underway in the global Catholic Church. The Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, a very famous theologian of the 20th century, once said that in the long run of history, the significance of the Second Vatican Council in the mid-1960s is that it marked the emergence of Catholicism as a self-consciously global family of faith that is no longer tied primarily to its European and later North American heritage, but really global. Now, Rahner was making a theological argument. What I want to suggest is that Catholic sociology in the 20th century lends empirical confirmation to the point. And that's what this chart is intended to communicate to you. The bar chart you see on the one side of the slide shows you what happened to the global Catholic population in the 20th century. As you can see, in 1900, at the dawn of the 20th century, that is scarcely more than 100 years ago, there were a grand total of 266 million Catholics in the world, of whom 200 million, that's the orange bar, lived in Europe and North America. Just 66 million in the entire rest of the planet. That was principally Latin America. This, of course, was before the population explosion of the 20th century. Just 100 years later, you can see what happened. By the year 2000, there were 1.1 billion Catholics in the world, of whom 720 million, that's the green bar, 720 million lived in the global south, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Oceania, with the remainder living in Europe and North America. Another way of putting that point is that just 100 years ago, only 25% of the global Catholic population lived in the southern hemisphere. By 2000, it was 65.5%, in other words, 2/3. And if we roll the clock forward to mid-century, the projection is that by then, by the middle of this century, it will be 75%. In other words, 3 out of every 4 Catholic men, women, and children alive will be living in the global south. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the most rapid, most sweeping, most profound transformation of Catholic demography in more than 2,000 years of church history. And we are living through it right now. Now, there are 2 corollaries to that I want to unpack. First, I know it is sometimes tempting for those of us who live in Europe and North America to be seduced by the notion that we are living in a time of Catholic decline. Because this is sometimes what we see, right? We see our schools closing. We see our parishes clustering. We experience a priest shortage. We struggle to hand on the faith to the next generation. And it is sometimes easy to believe that the Catholic story of our time is somehow that things are winding down, contracting, that we are getting smaller. Ladies and gentlemen, that may or may not be the reality in your own backyard, but I am here to tell you it was definitely not the global Catholic story of the 20th century. The global Catholic story of the 20th century was instead massive, phenomenal, runaway growth. It was the greatest period of missionary expansion in the history of Catholicism. And once again, we are living through it right now. All right, second corollary that I think is worth unpacking. Let's do some basic math. As of today, February 14, 2011, there are 1.2 billion Catholics in the world. There are 67 million Catholics in the United States, and there are a little under 13 million in Canada. What that means is that the Catholic population of North America represents less than 8% of the global Catholic population. Another way of putting that point is that in important respects, 92% of the Catholics in the world ain't like us. And by the way, if you ever wonder why the Pope is not thinking about North America when he gets out of the bed every morning, this may have something to do with it. You know, it's a much bigger and more complicated church out there. The point is that looking at Catholic realities in the 21st century exclusively through the prism of the priorities and preoccupations of those of us in North America simply won't do the trick. Okay? It doesn't do justice to the profound transformation that's occurred in our lifetime. All right, now look, the $64,000 question here obviously is, what does all of this mean, right? I mean, it's very interesting to know the numbers, it's very interesting to know where Catholics live these days, but the real question is, what's the impact of that going to be on the way that the church looks and feels and tastes and smells in the 21st century? Now, I'm going to try to answer that question for you, but before I do, I want to put a huge grain of salt on the table, okay? Here's the caveat. Anytime somebody tries to sell you generalizations about a pool of 720 million people, you want to be a little cautious, huh? Because for any generalized statement I could make about Catholicism in the global south, there are literally millions, if not tens of millions of exceptions. But that said, I think I can defend the following four generalizations. One, when it comes to faith and politics, I think what we are going to find from our brothers and sisters in the global south is that by our standards, they strike us as rather conservative on matters of sexual morality and the culture wars, rather progressive on virtually everything else, what we would consider to be broader questions of public policy and social justice. Now, before I unpack that, let me hasten to say that this business of dividing humanity up into liberals and conservatives, into left and right, this is our taxonomy, huh? It's not theirs. It doesn't occur naturally to people in other parts of the world. Having said that, we know what these terms mean, and I think at a rough and ready level they can help us. So, when it comes to the hot-button issues of the culture wars, things like abortion, gay rights, same-sex marriage, gender roles, the family, that cocktail of issues, there is a mainstream meat and potatoes social consensus in the global south, including in the Catholic Church in the south, that by our standards will come off as quite conservative, quite traditional. And if you want an example of how this plays out in a religious context, look at what's going on in the global Anglican communion today, right? Our brothers and sisters in the Anglican communion are on the brink of a historic schism between progressive Anglican churches in the north, particularly Canada and the United States, that are pressing ahead with the ordination of openly gay bishops and the blessing of same-sex unions. And all of that is being ferociously resisted by a more conservative center of gravity in the Anglican communion, which is predominantly in Africa. And by the way, if you want to know which way the winds are blowing in Anglicanism today, consider this. There are 79 million Anglicans in the world as of today. 41 million of them live in Africa. There are actually more practicing Anglicans, defined as Anglicans who attend church services at least once a week, more practicing Anglicans in the nation of Nigeria alone than there are in Great Britain, the mothership of the Anglican community. Huh? So pretty clear indication of which way things are trending. But when you change the subject from the culture wars to virtually everything else, okay, broader social justice issues, things like the ethics of free market global capitalism, the justice of trading relationships, war and peace, the environment, HIV/AIDS, race relations, that whole panorama of social concerns, you will once again find a meat and potatoes social consensus in the church in the global south that by our standards is going to come off as remarkably progressive or remarkably liberal. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the almost 8 years now, since April 2003, when the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq began, I have probably interviewed 300 Catholic bishops from the Global South. I have yet to find one, and I literally mean not one, who would not say that in his opinion that war violated the Church's traditional tests for a just war. Now, I realize that's a debatable point. We could have a conversation about it, but I'm just trying to describe a climate of opinion. So my point is that as the 21st century plays out, I think what we're going to be seeing from this new generation of leaders in the Church from the Global South is what is going to strike us as a somewhat counterintuitive blend of very conservative positions on some issues, very liberal positions on others. Now, another way of looking at that, of course, is that it comes close to what the late Cardinal Joseph Bernardin of Chicago in the States described as a consistent ethic of life. That is, an attempt to put the Church's pro-life and peace and justice concerns back together. Okay, but however you analyze it, I think increasingly that's what we're going to be seeing. Second, the point of departure for the Church in the Global South is very much the thought world of the Bible, not speculative academic theology. And among other things, that means the supernatural is real. It's palpable. It's close. You can almost reach out and touch it, and you're constantly expecting it to erupt in daily experience. So things like miracles and wonders, healings and deliverance, demonic combat and exorcism, all of those things that to us can sometimes seem a little quaint or hard to understand, this is very much part of the daily spiritual path of the vast majority of Catholics on the face of the planet. Now that has implications across the board, but let me give you just one. The ministry of healthcare. It does not occur naturally to most people on the planet, including most Catholics on the planet, to interpret illness exclusively in terms of physical cause and effect. They also interpret it in terms of the interplay of spirits, good spirits and bad spirits. And if you don't understand that, if you don't incorporate that into treatment strategies, you are not treating the whole person, and quite often your strategies aren't going to succeed. Okay? So it's an example of how we have to enter into this mindset in order to be able to do ministry effectively in the 21st century. Third, the real challenge for the Church in most parts of the world is not what it often is for us, which is what we perceive as the threat of secularism. Okay? It is instead pluralism. Here's what I mean. Okay, in Europe, in particular in Europe, but to some extent in North America, and I suppose in some ways particularly in Vancouver, I think we in the Church spend an awful lot of time worrying about the inroads of secularism, right? We get very worked up about the latest books from Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and, you know, the celebrity atheists of the world, and, you know, we worry about how, you know, there's a climate of religious indifference and people don't take religion seriously and on, and those are very real forces in our lives. But I'm here to tell you that on the vast majority of Catholics in the world, that is not what's in their backyard. I mean, outside Europe and some pockets of North America, you have to look pretty hard and pretty long to find an honest-to-God secularist, by which I mean somebody who has sort of thrown in the towel on religious faith and practice. Instead, the sort of grassroots pastoral dynamic facing the Church in most other parts of the world are the competitive dynamics of a very healthy religious marketplace. Okay? Here's the deal. If you are a Catholic leader in sub-Saharan Africa, what are you thinking about when you get out of bed in the morning? It certainly is not secularism. Depending on where you live, it might be the Christian Pentecostals, it might be Islam, it might be newfangled forms of indigenous religion. Okay? If you are on the Indian subcontinent, what's the primary pastoral challenge? Again, not secularism, it's the rise of Hindu radicalism. If you live in Latin America, what's the primary pastoral challenge? Again, outside of certain pockets of the major cities, it is not secularism, it's again the rise of Christian Pentecostalism. I mean, I don't know if you folks know this, but are you aware that more people converted from Catholicism to Protestantism in Latin America in the 20th century than did so in Europe in the century following the Protestant Reformation? The official estimate of the Latin American bishops is that at its peak in the 1990s, 8,000 Catholics were leaving the Church every day in Latin America to become Protestants, mostly Christian Pentecostals. Point is this, in most parts of the world, people are not choosing between belief and unbelief. They take belief for granted. They're choosing from among the various options on the kind of postmodern religious smorgasbord. Okay? Which means that the mindset of church leaders in most parts of the world is not ideological. It's not about ideological battles against secularism. It's practical and it's pastoral. It's how do we serve our people and how do we evangelize so we compete effectively in this very fluid and dynamic marketplace. It also, by the way, changes the social perception of the Catholic Church. In the West, again, particularly Europe and North America, the average person in the street is going to think of the Catholic Church as a very conservative institution. And, that's natural. If what they're comparing it to would be the liberal wing of the Democratic Party or whatever, obviously it's going to seem more conservative. But in most other parts of the world, if what you're comparing it to would be aggressive Christian Pentecostalism on the one hand and Islamic fundamentalism on the other, then the Catholic Church often stands out as the moderate, modern, sophisticated, rational religious alternative. Okay, so it changes the way people see the Church. All right, fourth and finally, if you want a defining characteristic of the Church in the Global South, ladies and gentlemen, this is it: youth and optimism. Here is a demographic factoid for you to put in your pipes and smoke. Okay? Do you know that according to the United Nations Population Division, 90% of the human population, that is 90%, 90, that is today under 14 years of age, lives in the Southern Hemisphere? And the Catholic Church in the Southern Hemisphere reflects those demographics. It is overwhelmingly young. I will tell you from personal experience that when you visit the typical Catholic parish in sub-Saharan Africa, you often don't know if you're in a church or a daycare center, okay? Because kids are literally hanging from the rafters. And we all know in terms of human psychology what that does. When there are a lot of young people around, it implies energy and optimism and dynamism. It gives you a sense of future. And that very much characterizes the psychology of church leaders in the Global South. They believe that their historical moment to lead has come. Okay? So in a nutshell, I think those are the kinds of things that the rise of the Global South throughout the 21st century will mean for the church we encounter, the new church that is sort of taking shape even as we speak. All right, if our first trend is largely about the Global South, our second trend is largely about the Global North. And it's what I call the rise of Evangelical Catholicism. And here I am obviously borrowing a term from our Protestant brothers and sisters and sort of translating it back into a Catholic context. Here's what I mean by it. First, a revival of traditional Catholic identity. Okay, so those markers of Catholic speech, Catholic thought, Catholic practice that over the centuries have sort of set us apart from the rest of the world and told us who we are. So just at a very visible level, I'm talking about things like priests wearing Roman collars. I'm talking about members of religious orders wearing the habit. I'm talking about Marian devotion and Eucharistic adoration. All of those markers of identity that 40 years ago, in the period immediately after the Second Vatican Council, to some extent went out of fashion, that today are very much staging a comeback. Second, I'm talking about the Evangelical Catholicism as public proclamation. That is, engaging the culture, the effort to transform the culture from the inside out in light of the gospel. Because that is the essence of the evangelical instinct, huh? You don't hide your faith under a bushel basket, you shout it from the rooftops. And then finally, third, faith understood as a matter of personal choice, as opposed to something you simply imbibe from homogeneous Catholic cultures and neighborhoods and schools and institutions and so on. Now, in that sense, Evangelical Catholicism is a natural byproduct of secularization, because that's what secularism does. It erodes those homogeneous religious enclaves. But I also want to tell you that Evangelical Catholicism is a very carefully and consciously crafted strategy to help insulate the church, to inoculate it, if you like, against being seduced by and assimilated to this kind of ultra-secular milieu that we see in Europe and some parts of North America. And if you don't believe that, you don't have to take my word for it, because I will cite no less an authority than the number 2 official in the power structure in the Holy See at the moment. This is the Cardinal Secretary of State, an Italian cardinal by the name of Tarcisio Bertone, whose picture you see here on the slide, who in 2007, when he was addressing a group of businessmen in Milan, was asked this very simple question: what is the main objective of the pontificate of Benedict XVI? And his answer was, as you can see on the slide, to recover authentic Christian identity in the context of widespread secularism. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the stated policy of the pontificate of Benedict XVI, and I would argue that in many important respects it was also the stated policy of the pontificate of John Paul II, which means that this concern to revive Catholic identity and to turn it into a force for evangelizing culture This has been the engine driving the policy-setting train of the Church for at least the last quarter century. Another way to put that point is that if you want to understand why decisions are being made the way they are these days, in the Vatican, at the level of national bishops' conferences, by bishops and their dioceses, and on, this is easily the most important trend to get your mind around. I don't think there is a single issue in the life of the Church these days that when officialdom, so to speak, takes a look at it, they are not asking themselves the question, what are the implications for Catholic identity, and how can we make sure that whatever else we do, we don't compromise a robust sense of Catholic distinctiveness, of Catholic identity. However, I also want to suggest that you are going to get this trend wrong if you understand it exclusively as a top-down force in the Church, because there is also a very strong bottom-up component to it. And I'll tell you where you see it most visibly these days. Where you see it would be in that kind of inner core of young Catholics these days. Now, I'm not talking about the broad mass of 20 and 30-something-year-old Catholics, many who are all over the map in terms of their attitudes towards religious faith and practice. But I'm talking about that inner core of committed young Catholics who are most likely to be our future priests, most likely to be our future religious, most likely to be our future theologians, our future lay leaders across the board. That inner cadre, so to speak, of young Catholics these days, there is a palpable evangelical energy. Now that has been abundantly documented. This slide simply gives you one example of the empirical data behind that claim. This is from a study sponsored by the National Religious Vocations Congress in the States of new members of men's and women's religious orders in the United States these days. That is, younger members who are entering religious life. The study contrasted the older generation, which they called the Vatican II generation, people who came of age in the years immediately after the Second Vatican Council, with the millennial generation, that is, those born after 1982. And what they found is a sharp contrast in attitudes and values between the two groups. Younger members of religious orders these days tend to be much more interested in wearing the habit. They tend to be much more interested in, they put a greater priority on fidelity to the Church, and they tend to choose their religious community on the basis of its reputation for fidelity. They're much more attracted to traditional spirituality, such as the Liturgy of the Hours, Marian devotion, and so on. They tend to have much more positive attitudes towards authority in the Church, and all of these would be defining characteristics of that evangelical Catholic instinct. And if you want the payoff bit of data from my study, or from this study, that is the kind of money quote that gives you a sense of which way the winds are blowing, here it is. The study contrasted new members in women's religious orders in the United States. There are two umbrella groups for women's orders in the States. There's the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, which by reputation is the more liberal group. There's the Council of Major Superiors of Women, which by reputation is the more conservative or traditional group. What it found is that for those orders that belong only to the first group, the more liberal one, and a lot of orders belong to both, but for those that belong only to the liberal group, less than 1% of them have 10 or more new members in the initial stages of formation. That is, 10 or more new members. For those orders that belong exclusively to the more conservative or traditional group, 28% of them have at least 10 members in the initial stages of formation. Okay? Crystal clear indication of which way things are trending. So my point is that we have a double whammy in Catholic life today. We have a top-down concern with Catholic identity, and we have a bottom-up groundswell of hunger for clarity about identity for younger Catholics. And I think, by the way, it's wrong to understand that in ideological terms, as if these younger Catholics are somehow choosing the right over the left in the culture wars. I don't think that's it. I think it's about their generational experience. These younger Catholics today did not grow up in a stuffy, all-controlling church that they're reacting against. They grew up in a rootless secular world, and they are hungry to know who they are. Okay, so I think it's much more about generational experience than it is ideology. But in any event, we have this kind of perfect storm, if you like, of top-down and bottom-up energy, which means there is no zone of Catholic life, there is no ministry, no apostolate, nothing the Church does these days that is immune from hard questions about Catholic identity. How do we know what you're doing is authentically and fully Catholic? How do we protect that identity? And how do we communicate it to the rest of the world? Now, I can pick any area of Catholic life to illustrate the point, but let's just talk for a moment about the liturgy. It works well because it's something we all experience. This concern for Catholic identity, this evangelical momentum, is why the Holy Father in 2007 issued a motu proprio authorizing wider celebration of the Old Latin Mass, the so-called Tridentine Rite, because over the centuries it has been such a classic vehicle to shape Catholic identity. This is why in the English-speaking world we have gone through an exhausting process of retranslating the texts that we pray at the Mass and the other sacraments of the Church in an effort to inject a stronger sense of Catholic identity into those texts. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why on some Sunday in the not-too-distant future, when you show up at your local parish for Mass and the celebrant says to you, "The Lord be with you," your answer will no longer be, "and also with you." It will be, say it with me, "and with your spirit." Because this is a more faithful translation of the Latin original et cum spiritu tuo. It is also, by the way, how it's translated in most other languages. My point is that if you try to see that in isolation as a kind of isolated event, you're going to get it wrong. You have to see that as a small piece of a much bigger picture. And the bigger picture is this defining concern in the Church these days to foster a strongly evangelical spirit that is rooted in a solid, uncompromising sense of what it means to be Catholic. Okay? All right, the first two trends we looked at are sort of ad intra, that is, they come out of the Church's internal life. Let's talk about a couple that come at us from the outside that are more ad extra. One, the biotech revolution. Okay, by which I mean all the mind-boggling new ways science and technology is presenting us with these days to manipulate human life at its most basic levels and in its earliest stages. My claim is that the effort to kind of bring an ethical sensitivity to the biotech revolution is increasingly going to occupy the time and treasure of the Catholic Church in the 21st century. Now, I could illustrate that point by picking any one of these biotech debates on this list at random. I think if you add all this stuff up, debates over cloning and genetic engineering and so-called savior babies and so forth, what we come to is a basic philosophical question that we will be facing in the 21st century, which is that in an era in which human personality can be manipulated from behind a computer screen like a piece of software, in an era in which species membership is fungible, in which DNA can cross species lines the way some people cross state lines on their way to work every morning, okay? In such an era, what are the bedrock principles of human dignity that are going to guarantee respect for the human person? Now again, I can pick any one of these issues at random to illustrate the conundrum that the biotech revolution raises, but I'm going to pick the 9th item on this list, debates over chimeras. Now, this, ladies and gentlemen, was the chimera of antiquity. Okay? It was a multiple-headed monster that was the scourge of sailors in the ancient world, and those of you who know your classics will know that this chimera was slain by Bellerophon riding astride the winged horse Pegasus. Okay? Obviously not what scientists today mean by chimeras. Okay? What scientists today mean by chimeras are instead organisms that carry more than one genetic signature. That is, that have more than one set of DNA. Now, chimeras do occur on a very rare basis in nature. There's about 0.005% of the human population. But if you give them a DNA test on Wednesday, you'll get one result. You give them another test on Saturday, you'll get a second result. But what is far more common these days is that chimeras are being artificially created in laboratories and research farms around the world. Let me give you an example. I don't know if any of you have been to a hospital recently and had a blood transfusion. But if you have, there is a better than even chance that at one point the blood that is now swimming in your veins was moving through the circulatory system of a hog. Because what is happening these days is due to a shortage of human blood donors, embryonic hogs, which actually have the circulatory system that most closely parallels the human system, embryonic hogs are being injected with human blood proteins, allowed to manufacture those proteins as they reach adulthood. Then the blood is removed, synthesized, purified, and turned into human blood additives. What this means in practice is that there are about 100,000 or so hogs on the surface of the planet these days that are carrying human DNA. Now, you may say to yourself, that's kind of ethically unproblematic. All right, let me give you another case. The research scientist Irving Weissman at Stanford University recently carried out a protocol in which he injected embryonic mice with a sufficient amount of human brain cells that when they reached adulthood, 1% of their adult brains were composed of human neurological matter. That is, they were carrying around a tiny sliver of the human brain. Now, the point, of course, is he wanted to study neurological diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and you can't do that with adult human subjects. Okay, so this wasn't some mad cat science. Now, you may say, all right, a mouse with 1% of a human brain, we can make sense of that. Well, riddle me this, Batman. Weizmann's new proposal, which has been not carried out but green-lighted by the Stanford Ethics Committee, is to inject embryonic mice with a sufficient amount of human neurological material that when they become adults, 100% of their adult brains will be composed of human brain cells. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if that is the chimera of yesterday, behold the chimera of tomorrow. Now I ask you, from the point of view of Roman Catholic bioethics and moral anthropology, what is the moral status of a race of Stuart Little? Now, granted, because of the architecture of the mouse brain, these mice are not going to be doing the New York Times crossword puzzle over their morning tea. They're not going to be writing essays on Kant's critique of pure reason. But nevertheless, given how central the human brain is as a carrier of human personality and human identity, does the fact that these mice are going to have miniature human brains, does that somehow change their moral taxonomy? Does it make them somehow more than animal, albeit still less than fully human? If so, do they have new rights and do we have new duties towards them? Now, please don't rush to throw up your hands to volunteer an answer, because I sure as hell don't have one. My point is instead, this is an example of the kind of mind-bendingly new ethical question we are going to be facing throughout the 21st century. Here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. Think about the old bioethical debates, things like abortion and homosexuality and contraception. I mean, as a culture, yes, we're still badly divided about them, but we are in many ways very comfortable with them. Those debates have been around for more than 2,000 years. This kind of question hasn't even been around 2 decades. And unfortunately, there is no analog of Moore's law in the realm of ethical wisdom. You all know Moore's law? It says that the computational capacity of the computer will double every 24 months. Well, there is no guarantee that our ethical wisdom is going to double every 24 months, and every reason to believe that it's going to continue to lag behind the pace of technological change. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we need to be frightened by these technologies. They're in fact rich with the potential to cure disease and liberate human personality. But they are also fraught with ethical peril. And of course, the danger of our time is that examination of those ethical questions is going to be ceded to a high priesthood as scientific experts, because the rest of us will feel disenfranchised. All right, so it's going to be an enormous pastoral priority for the church in the 21st century to make sure that ordinary people remain stakeholders in this conversation. Catholic Church has an enormously rich heritage of rational moral reflection to bring to bear on these questions, but we need to make sure that that's something that's happening in the Catholic marketplace, not just behind closed doors by a narrow cast of self-appointed experts. All right, final trend we're going to look at, and then we'll close: globalization. And by this, I mean largely economic globalization. The picture you see on this slide comes from that famous moment in September 1999 when the rock star Bono from the band U2 went off to Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence in the hills outside of Rome, to visit John Paul II to talk about how the Pope and pop stars could combine forces in the great Jubilee year of 2000 to promote debt relief for the world's poor. Now, I actually had the opportunity to interview Bono shortly after this picture was taken, and he told me the story. Those of you who know Bono will know that his trademark look are those powder blue sunglasses that he wears, right? And he wore them into this audience with the Pope. And I don't know if you know how these things work, but these kind of private audiences, semi-private audiences, the way it works is the group comes in, the VIPs sit in the first couple rows. Then the Vatican entourage comes in and sits on either side of the Holy Father. Then the Pope comes in, sits down. Somebody from the group gets up and gives a little talk, then the Pope gives a talk, and only at the end are the VIPs introduced to the Pope, okay? So Bono was sitting there in the front row during the first part of this audience, and he noticed that John Paul is staring like a laser beam at his sunglasses. So a little time goes by, and he decides, well, geez, maybe this is inappropriate. So he takes them off, puts them in his pocket like this. He notices that John Paul is still staring. Okay? So at the end of the audience, finally, when he's brought up to meet the Pope, okay, he shakes hands, Then he takes off his sunglasses and he says, Holy Father, do you want to put these on? And John Paul's answer was, yes, that's what I've been wanting to do for the last 45 minutes. Now catch the point, okay? John Paul was one of those rare, kind of once-in-a-lifetime freak of nature, natural communicators who understood that that picture was going to say more in a flash than any 800-word news analysis ever would about the intersection of the sacred and the secular in defense of the world's poor. Okay? And it had that effect. In the Jubilee year of 2000, significant debt relief for the world's poor was accomplished. It wasn't completely wiped out, but a significant dent was put into it. And in fact, when President Bill Clinton signed the U.S. debt relief statute into law in 2000, he actually referred to this picture. He said that when you have the Pope and the pop stars singing from the same songbook, it tells you which way the heavens are aligned. Okay? My argument is that this effort to forge coalitions with other Christians, with other religions, and with women and men of goodwill to promote social justice objectives will become a front-burner priority for the Church in the 21st century. That is not only because these are the top pastoral priorities of our brothers and sisters in the global South, who of course are living on the front lines of those who were excluded from the benefits of globalization, but also because there are social realities in the 21st century that cannot help but engage people of conscience. Point this slide intends to make is that from the point of view of our social justice concerns, we face a kind of odd and complex best of times, worst of times dynamic. On the one hand, it is a fact, not a theory, not a hypothesis, not a neocon myth. It is a fact that the spread of free market global capitalism in the 20th century lifted more people out of poverty more rapidly than in any other time in human history. Okay, the emergence of a free market in places like China and India, those two countries alone, cut the rate of the world's population that lives in extreme poverty, defined by the United Nations as under $1 a day, cut that rate in half, from 40% to 20%. Okay. You could make an argument based on this data that the rise of a free market global economy is, in fact, the most successful humanitarian program, the most successful anti-poverty program ever invented. And therefore, it is not as simple as standing on the sidelines and critiquing globalization. And I say this because sometimes I think the social justice people in the Church tend to get seduced by the anti-globalization rhetoric of the secular left, as if all we need to do is sort of throw bricks at globalization and complain about it, and we will be prophetic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the situation is much more complicated than that. There's a great deal to be embraced and encouraged. The challenge is not to get rid of globalization. The challenge is to make sure that circle of opportunity continues to expand. Because the shadow side of all of this is that far too many people are still excluded from the new opportunities that a globalized world has created. As you can see, there are still 1.2 billion people on the face of the planet that survive on less than $1 a day, that is, that live in extreme poverty. There are 10 million children who die every year from the so-called diseases of poverty. We're talking about things like diphtheria, cholera, malaria, typhoid. And you don't need some glittering new biotech fix to address that. All you need is the political will to get the resources to the people who need it. Of course, as you know, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history, and it does not appear from the early stages of the 21st century that things are notably more pacific. And I think in the most grotesque indicator of the inequalities we face, it is once again a fact, not a liberal myth, but a fact, that the gross domestic product of the 42 most impoverished nations on earth combined is less than the bank accounts of three people, the three wealthiest individuals on earth. We're talking about Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and the Mexican telecommunications mogul Carlos Slim. Those three guys have bank accounts and assets greater than the GDP of 42 nations on earth that represent a population of almost 200 million people. Now, obviously, those realities have to engage people of conscience. Again, I would suggest they will be top priorities for the Church, not only for that reason, but because our theologians and our pastors and our lay activists across the global South, this is their top concern, this cocktail of issues. It's not fighting the culture wars. It's not doing battle with secularism. It's the front burner, meat and potatoes, pastoral realities that they face, which include, in many ways, trying to minister to the victims, if you like, those excluded from the emergence of a free market global economy. All right? Final thought, and then we'll be done, because I know we have lunch to be had, and believe me, ladies and gentlemen, it is a sacramental duty for me to make sure you're all at lunch on time. But I want to make one final point before I leave you, which is that the four trends that we have talked about, and the others that we didn't get to, in my opinion, these trends are all tremendously exciting. I think they're rich with potential to unleash creative new Catholic energy. But I think if we are honest with ourselves, we also have to admit that they are fraught with peril. And I think the principal peril is that they could exacerbate the existing divisions within the church. Because let's face it, these are all complicated matters, and there's more than one Catholic opinion about the right way to respond to them. Okay, I suspect there's probably more than one opinion in this room about what the right way to respond to them is. We are already, as a church, in many ways, a house divided among ourselves. I think if we are not careful, the complexities and the new challenges, both welling up from within and crashing in them from without in the 21st century, could quite literally tear us apart. And so I think the core challenge we are going to face, before we get to any of the specific trends I've outlined, the core challenge we're going to have to face is recovering the will to concentrate more on those things that unite us rather than those things that divide us. And if you'll bear with me for just 2 or 3 more minutes, I'm going to tell you one last parable to try to drive that point home, and then I'll be done. Okay? Here's my concluding parable. As Father said at the outset, I grew up in rural western Kansas. Now, I have no earthly idea if anyone in this room has ever been to rural western Kansas, and to tell you the truth, I can think of no reason why you should have been. But if you ever have been, you will know it is not exactly a thriving crossroads of the tourist industry. In fact, the only time of the year we get significant numbers of out-of-town visitors is in the fall, because that's pheasant hunting season. And there's a certain kind of guy who finds the idea of blasting shotguns and wearing combat fatigues for a weekend to be a real hoot. Now, to tell you the truth, this is usually done while consuming massive amounts of beer, so generally they're a far greater threat to one another than they are to the pheasants. But nevertheless, they come. Just to give you a sense of the cultural milieu I'm trying to describe. My 96-year-old grandma, God bless her, lives in a small western Kansas hamlet called Hill City. There is one 11-room motel in that place. It's called the Western Hills Motel. And ladies and gentlemen, as I said to you, I have traveled the highways and byways of the world. I've stayed at some pretty funky lodgings, hither and yon. But I'm here to tell you, this is the only hotel I have ever stayed in where there is a laminated sign in the bathroom that reads, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." I kid you not. The first time I took my wife there, she said, "Is this some kind of weird sexual double entendre?" No. This is face value stuff. This parable is set on one weekend during pheasant hunting season. We've got a guy, let's call him a lawyer from New York City, who has come out to Graham County, America to try to bag himself a bird. He spent a long and frustrating weekend without success, and finally, it's the middle of the day Sunday, he has to go home. He decides before he departs the field, he's going to take one final shot. So, he sees a pheasant moving across the skyline. He shoulders his weapon. He fires. And miracle of miracles, he brings down the bird. And so now, flushed with triumph, he sets across the field to pick up his trophy, and just as he gets to the place where the pheasant is fallen, he comes across a barbed wire fence that is clearly labeled "Private Property, Keep Out." But he has invested way too much blood, toil, tears, and sweat at this point, so he starts to climb the fence. And as he's doing so, the western Kansas farmer pulls up in his tractor and says, "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" He says, "Well, that's my pheasant, I'm going to pick it up." Farmer says, "Oh no, you're not. That bird fell on my property, it belongs to me." Now, the lawyer's tired, he's in a hurry, he's frustrated, he just erupts and he says, "Look, you don't understand. I am a senior partner in a top 10 law firm in New York, and if you don't let me have that bird, I'm going to sue you back to the Stone Age." Not understanding, of course, this is pretty much where the farmer already lives. I grew up there, so it's okay for me to say this stuff. So the farmer just looks at him and smiles and says, "Well, that may be how you do things where you come from. But around here, we got a little something called the 3-kick rule." 3-kick rule, what's that about? Farmer says, "It's very simple. I kick you 3 times, then you kick me 3 times. We keep going. Whoever eventually gives up loses the bird." The lawyer thinks, well, it's probably less expensive than a lawsuit. Plus, this guy looks like he's 900 years old. I could probably take him. Says, "All right, let's do it." So they square off against one another. Farmer looks him in the eye and says, "Are you ready?" Lawyer says, yes, I am. Now, the farmer, you understand, is wearing these heavy mud-clawed Western Kansas work boots, right? So he gives him one shot in the shins. The guy screams in pain. Another shot in the solar plexus. This time, his howls of agony can be heard to the Nebraska border. And I can tell there are like 3 people in the middle who know their Western Kansas geography, because this is a fair stretch from where I'm talking about. Right, gives him one last shot under the chin. This time he's seeing stars, he's barely conscious. And finally, with his last best ounce of effort, the lawyer staggers to his feet, dusts himself off, puts this look of grim determination on his face, looks at the farmer and says, all right, you old coot, now it's my turn. And the farmer looks back and smiles and says, that's all right, I give up, you can have the bird. That's how we roll, Western Kansas style. Now look, ladies and gentlemen, here's the point. I would submit to you that too often our internal conversations in the Catholic Church boil down to a kind of ecclesiastical version of the three-kick rule. That is, too often we are not really interested in a patient search for understanding with Catholics who may think differently than we do, who may worship differently than we do, who may vote differently than we do. Too often, instead, what we're really interested in doing is scoring rhetorical cheap shots against people we perceive to be our ideological and theological enemies. Now, under any set of circumstances, that way of organizing our relationships in the Church would be not only repugnant, but impossible to reconcile with the ecclesiology of communion to which both John Paul II and Benedict XVI have repeatedly called us. But in this brave new world I'm trying to describe, of flabbergasting new challenges, both from within and without, this ideologized, tribalized way of conceiving our relationships in the Church is quite literally going to be a death sentence. So do you want the pastoral payoff from everything I've tried to say to you today? Here it is. In the first instance, our challenge is to rebuild what the slide refers to as a kind of place-at-the-table spirituality. That is, a kind of popular psychology and ecclesiology in the Church, in which we believe that all the different Catholic tribes out there, all the different slices of life, somehow have a place at the table. None of them have the final answer to the problems facing the Church. And that we are inclined in the first instance to listen rather than to condemn, to emphasize those things that bring us closer to one another rather than those things that drive us apart. And to create that kind of psychology and ecclesiology in the Church, make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, that is not in the first instance a work for our hierarchy to do. It has to be worked out in collaboration with them, of course. That's part of what an ecclesiology of communion means. But real creative change in the Church almost never comes from the top down first. It wells from the bottom up and is only gradually and over time ratified at the top. Which means that the architects, the artisans, the engineers of this place-at-a-table spirituality in the first instance are not going to be our bishops or our theologians or our other experts. It's going to be all of us, beginning here in this room. And so let me leave you with this final sort of fervorino, this final plea, if you like. Go forth as educators, as those who are forming the next generation of Catholic youth and Catholic leaders, and do your level best to instill in them this spirituality of communion, this place-at-the-table approach to understanding Catholic life, because that is the fundamental prerequisite for meeting every other challenge that we face in the 21st century. And ladies and gentlemen, having spent some time with you, I have no doubt, none whatsoever, that you are going to rise to that challenge. And as your chronicler and your scribe, that is the guy who gets paid to watch what you do and then run off and write about it or talk about it on TV, I look forward, as this century rolls forward, to chronicling your success, to having a front row seat and being a witness to the fantastic work that I know that you are going to do. And so, thank you for your hospitality, thank you for your graciousness, God bless you, and as we say in Italian, andiamo avanti. Thank you all very much.